everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Natalie Smolenski. Now, Natalie is the executive director of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. She does work with the Bitcoin Policy Institute. She's an entrepreneur, I'd say a historian, anthropologist, political theorist, and so much more. And this conversation was probably everything you'd expect from Natalie and more. We talked about so many different things in terms of global affairs, in terms of actually creating a science out of the politic, in terms of a paper that she's working on for the Satoshi Papers, which will be a book issued and coming out sometime in 2024, which we and she will keep you all posted on. So this was just such a fantastic conversation, talking about the anthropology of money and creating an anthropological theory of money and how important that is. We talked about so many things in this podcast and really focused so much on how to live as a society, global affairs, and how to interact on the globe, and just the changing world order, I'd argue, that we're experiencing right now and going forward, with many, many world wars occurring and so many different things happening, and where there may be hope to be found going forward, especially in a day and age when hope can be hard to find with some of these hard things. So this was a challenging conversation. It was many hard and difficult topics that we talked about. So if you're listening to this podcast and you have any feedback on it, on this episode, or want to get in touch, please do. You can reach out at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. And I'm sure Natalie would be more than open to hear from you as well with any thoughts. But please feel free to follow along with Natalie. She's one of my favorite voices in the space and is just really, really smart with how she approaches all of these different things. So this is a really fun conversation for me as well, being someone that is steeped in social theory and political theory and all of these things. So it was a pleasure to have Natalie on, and we'll be sure to do this again sometime. So thank you so much, Natalie, again for coming on. And also I want to mention our promo links in our show notes as well that you can find to Bitbox and Saz Mining for discounts on those products. So be sure to check those out from our amazing sponsors. And then we also have something new that we're engaging in. So for this episode and going forward, this is the first of many shout outs that we'll be doing from our Geyser Fund. So these are folks that have projects or books or different things they want to get out, as well as supporting our podcast in the process via our Geyser Fund. So if you're interested in doing a shout out or having a shout out or any other ad opportunities, you can head to our Geyser Fund, which is also in the show notes, to figure out how to support our podcast and also get your project or initiative out to our audience. So this week is Tim. So I've gotten this book from Tim and just wanted to give a shout out to Tim. History Echoes Bitcoin here. So really excited to share this project with you and share this book with you. And I've got a little excerpt from Tim to give a shout out to in terms of his book. So we'll be sure to include this in the show notes as well for you to go and purchase. So History Echoes Bitcoin serves as a connection between history and the properties represented in Bitcoin. Of those are permissionless, gaining consensus, decentralization, trust minimizing, censorship resistant, open source collaboration, immutability, and scarcity. This book aims to show how the properties that give Bitcoin its value are each individually beneficial and collectively compelling. Zoom out. Awesome excerpt from Tim there. So be sure to get his book, History Echoes Bitcoin. We'll include the Amazon link and other links as well for you to purchase that. And thanks again, Tim, for being the first shout out supporter. And we'll be sure to post this across our socials as well. All right, a little bit longer intro than usual this time around. Thanks for sticking with us. Enjoy the episode, and we will see you again next week. Hi, Natalie. Welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner.
It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Honored to have you on. I think I've learned an incredible amount from you, and I know so many other people are. And this conversation too, I really love when we get to explore humanities stuff on the podcast. I'm not technical. I think Bitcoin has taught me to be a bit more technical, so I can fumble my way through things. But talking about philosophy, history, sociology, I just want to nerd out in this episode on all of those things. Now, before we jump in, though, a lot of people will know who you are. But for those that are trickling in more and more to the podcast, do you want to introduce yourself, who you are, maybe a little bit of your background and what you're focusing on?
Sure. So I'm a scholar and entrepreneur. Back in 2016, I co-founded a company that built the first generation of digital identity standards anchored to Bitcoin. We were one of the first Bitcoin oriented SaaS companies in the world. Exited that company in 2020. I continue to do business development for enterprise software at the acquiring entity. And I also have a background as an anthropologist and a historian. So I'm very focused on political economy, theory of self and society. And I am the founder of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation, which is a research oriented 501c3 that is putting out original research about Bitcoin and political economy. So our first book is coming out next year, the Satoshi Papers. I have an essay in that book, as do a number of other prominent Bitcoiners. So we're looking forward to bringing some of that research and education mandate to the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know I posted on social media this morning. I mean, at the time of this recording, it's early mid-November. So when people listen out, but there are a ton of books coming out for 2024 with guests that I've had on, with kind of murmurings I've heard of maybe, maybe not. So it's going to be a really exciting time for what I'm hoping will, obviously number go up stuff with Bitcoin will bring in more mainstream interest, but I think there's a lot more scholarly work taking place in Bitcoin than
Mhm.
ever before, whether it's on the environmental front, on the social humanities front, economics. So really excited for those things to come out next year. I think that'll bring a whole new wave of interest in Bitcoin as well. And you were so gracious to send me a chapter, kind of what you've been working on for this book that I was able to read through for this conversation. And it's a lot. It's heavy. It's good. But I definitely had to comb through it very carefully when I was reading through. And I was nerding out. I mean, my happy place is social theory and exactly some of the stuff that you were writing about. But I thought it was a great examination of money, of an anthropological case and view of money. Some interesting thoughts on David Graeber and all of that stuff that we'll get into, and even mentioning some Twitter fighting that happened. I thought was
Yeah.
really interesting as well. Some of the conversation that happened a few years back with Graeber and others. But I'm really I rarely talk about, very intentionally, price of Bitcoin on the show and things like that. I think something I'm really looking forward to next year, like all of these books that are coming out, all of the human rights use cases, all of the environmental use cases, and something that's really important, for our progressive audience to kind of understand. Most people in the world don't think about what is money in general and how to articulate things like that. So I know from your point of view, when you're focusing on Bitcoin or thinking about Bitcoin, where is the most comfortable place for you to come from on this? I know you have an anthropology background, you have a history background, you have so many things I think that are converging, right? I'm not sure even what you would necessarily label yourself in terms of scholarly output. It all converges, but that's
Mhm.
Bitcoin as well. It's so many converging worlds, so it's hard to label one. But when you look at Bitcoin, what's one of your favorite ways to look at Bitcoin, or what lens do you use to analyze Bitcoin, and what do you enjoy writing about most?
Well, I approach Bitcoin from a social theory standpoint. So obviously very interdisciplinary. I myself have an interdisciplinary background in anthropology, history, philosophy, um, you know, disciplines that are sometimes referred to as political economy, political theology. So, we don't really have a science of the social or a science of the political in the same way that we have, let's say, a science of biology or a science of physics.
Hmm.
Um, and so, you know, one of one of my core interests spanning my career has been to move us progressively towards a science of the social. But that is no small feat. And so at the moment, I'm sort of surveying what has been said across various social scientific disciplines and the humanities about um, the intersection of technology and society, and kind of gleaning these observations into what I take to be uh, a point of departure. So a coherent theory of money, which I'm starting with in this book, which is a departure point for a theory of technology and society.
I'm curious too, for my own interest. So I was looking into a little bit more of your background and some of your education and things like that. Going from a PhD, where, correct me if I'm wrong, focusing your dissertation on some mental health aspects, some history, some religion, things like that, and then finding yourself in this Bitcoin space now and landscape. How do you connect the studies of those two worlds and the skills that you learned through that process to what you're doing today?
Well, my interest, my overarching interest is on the development of human subjects within a social milieu. So the relationship between the individual and society, which at the youngest ages, I mean, from infancy, society for an infant is their most immediate network of caregivers. And then as the infant matures and undergoes development and various forms of ontogenesis, their society gets progressively wider. Um, so the question of health and illness is, of course, not an individual question. You know, particularly when we're talking about something as um, diffuse as mental or psychological health, what we're talking about is the health of the social milieu in which the infant, the child, the person is coming to be. And so that touches on everything from forms of domination, submission in the family of origin, to the economic system in which that family is embedded, the political system in which that family is embedded. Um, all of these sort of concentric circles of social organization and transacting impact the developmental trajectory of the human person. And so when we talk about something like political reform, the question is reform toward what? And generally, you know, people who are activists or who have a political point of view are functioning from some implicit notion of health, of what health is and what illness is. But they don't have a theory of it, they have a feeling of it. And so part of what we need when we talk about a science of the social or science of the political is we need a theory of the healthy community, and by proxy, the healthy individual. So all of these questions, when we talk about questions of values, principles, ideal states, ideal on the basis of what? At the end of the day, there has to be a scientific account for those values. And that does not exist yet.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And there were a few, I took some screenshots here. There were a few tweets that you did recently, that I thought were really interesting. I think so much of it is in the cloud, I would assume as well, of just what's going on in the world, kind of our global affairs of obviously Russia-Ukraine conflict going on for quite
Yeah.
a while now, although it seems like it was recent. It's been a couple of years, really,
Yeah.
year and a half, 2 years. I'm not exactly sure at this point. Obviously, what's happening in Israel right now, in Gaza and Palestine. One thing, just on the topic of healthy community, one thing you said in general about politics, and most of the people that come on this show, we end up having a conversation about two things almost every episode, regardless of who I'm talking to. It's how do we critically think, and the left-right divides are
Yeah.
really toxic. Lisa Huff on recently was just like, I don't understand. I don't get it. I hate it. And I'm articulating from that progressive camp, but I do as well. I think a lot of people at the end of the day, whether they're intentionally contributing to it or not, or unintentionally, a lot of people would say these divides are toxic in so many ways. And a lot of these divides shouldn't really exist in an ideal world. But one of the things you said, it's a little bit longer, bear with me. The traditional political labels of right and left are becoming increasingly meaningless. that gives us the opportunity to genuinely engage with people and think together, but it upsets partisans who wants to determine in advance who the good guys and the bad guys are. Be skeptical of anyone who talks about what leftists or right wingers believe. They rarely, if ever, define their terms and often use these words to make arguments from fear or hate. Anyone trying to scare or trigger you into agreeing with them is
Mhm.
manipulating. So you were touching on some things just there, but I wanted to pull that out. I thought that was such an incredible insight. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think you put out there, whether in your writing, through different talks, through your social media, that is just trying to cut through the noise. Like I see that interdisciplinary approach trying to cut through the noise to get to some truth, to get to some healthy community and just a healthy state of global affairs. So, even when you were asking, what do you want to talk about in this episode? I'm like, well, with Natalie, what is there not to talk about? Just with like the way that you put things out, I think a lot of people see and feel you really searching for truth. Um, at least I do. And that's really hard. So break that down a little bit more for me, that tweet that I just read out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll, in my extremely online life, regularly come across tweets from people that are like, leftists did this again. Leftists believe this, or,
Hmm.
this right wing guy, or right wing candidate, blah, blah, blah. Um, and when you actually, look at these people who are referred to by these labels, they are far more complex and nuanced than any label could give them. It's a form of
Hmm.
it's a form of disrespect to refer to people by labels. Um,
Hmm.
Even if they do identify as right or left, who cares? What do they have to
Hmm.
say? It's, there's this proliferation of ad hominem attacks everywhere you look. And
Hmm.
that's obviously not thinking. It's warfare and violence. Um, so, what should matter is the content of what this person has to say. Um, is what they're saying true about this?
Hmm.
But the way that, we've seemed to function politically as a society is through association. Are you on my team or on my enemy team or on some other team that I don't
Hmm.
care about? And then everything kind of becomes this spiraling logic of association from there. Oh, you might not want to listen to anything this person has to say because they're affiliated, in my mind, with this team. Well, that is those are the conditions for the opposite of truth. They're the conditions
Hmm.
for a flattening of discourse. So, you know, we have like one association for every label and really strong opinions based on that one association of like a fully flat social terrain where there's no depth, and it's just these associations battling it out. It's terrible.
Yeah, I feel that a lot, even just on this platform, right? Um, Obviously, in kind of inheriting this endeavor from Mark Stefani, who had been running this podcast since 2021 and trying to build a coalition of progressives and fighting left FUD in terms of Bitcoin. And then what I kind of encountered along the way, two different types of groups. I think in response of, yeah, I joke with people a lot, like the word progressive is such a weighty word in the United States. Elsewhere, they don't know
Mhm.
what it means, right? And then I'll kind of describe what I'm talking about. Values. Okay, we get that. We have our own version of that, right? And then Bitcoiner can turn off the left or progressives from this group, right? So who are we left with at the end of the day? But a lot of times, I'm getting more and more people to tune into this podcast or to see what we're having to say because of just that, what we're talking about, who we're talking to. And I went back and forth for a long time about, what do I do with this title,
Mhm.
right? Is this title kind of preventing people from accessing content and things like that? And I still do, if I'm being honest, but part of me keeps it because of the FUD narrative with progressives, especially heavily right now. So being intentional about utilizing that. But there are all sorts of people from any type of, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's the political left, whoever, that see me associating as a progressive and they say, oh, he must think this, or see me associating as a Bitcoiner, oh, he must think this, right? And doing those type of things, and rather than just sitting down and talking. But we do that with each other all the time, always. Oh, you're a woman that lives in Texas, you must feel this. Or, oh, you're a man that lives on the coast, you must think this. It goes just so heavily. And I'm wondering too, obviously social media plays into this, right? But from your point of view, how has social media contributed to this? Um, is this just the road we're going to keep barreling down in terms of all the ways we gather and disseminate information at this point?
Yeah, I mean, we've there's been some research done on the architecture of communities networked through various social media platforms, and I mean, polarization is a real thing. I mean, it's measurable. You can see that
Mhm,
based on the graph of who people follow, who they engage with. These like little bubbles form, um, and I mean, ultimately the addictiveness of these platforms is predicated on eliciting certain kind of dopamine reaction when you either see something you really agree with, or something that makes you really outraged, and disagree with.
mhm,
So there's a kind of manipulation of the emotional predispositions that people have on these platforms. That said, that's not an excuse for some kind of nostalgia to a pre-social media era. Like there's no going back.
mhm,
So what is being demanded of us, and I would suggest is actually happening, is a new form of media literacy where we are, as a species, being asked to cultivate more discernment around the content that we ingest and our reactions to that content. So you see it now. I mean, people are not um, as given to simply believe what they see and hear today as they
mhm,
were, let's say, during when the Iraq War was being fomented, pre social media, and you only had the MSM narratives, which were, you know, parroting the state administration narrative,
mhm,
and it really took a lot of work for people to be critical. Now there's profound suspicion, and people do, check their sources more than they used to, and they do a kind of what I'd call amateur historiography. Um, the problem with that is that if you don't have a impartial methodology behind that, then it very quickly just becomes authority discourses. And so your source criticism becomes a form of ad hominem attacks. And
mhm,
so I think what we're being asked to do as technological development accelerates is to ourselves level up as a species. Like we have to become the people
mhm,
who can use this technology without destroying our societies, without destroying ourselves, frittering our lives away. Um, these are character imperatives. And
mhm.
it's unclear what social institutions will form or arise out of this cauldron, to develop the character that is required to wield these technologies.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think, a lot of people, a lot of conversations, a lot of media, podcasts, financial institutions interested, the government interested in AI. And, there's a lot of, we have this media literacy and this constant fire hose of information. And then you're seeing some things like I've seen some different things on, Twitter's community notes, right? Those things that have been popping up more and more. And there's different views on, some people are saying, okay, this community note wasn't applied here. How come this one doesn't have one, but this one does? And, so that's an imperfect system too. But just the thought of just what you said, people are questioning and checking assumptions. And then in some cases, adding those notes. And many of them turn out to be,
Mhm.
those are good notes. Those are good things for the public to have access to besides just that statement alone. So we're seeing some things like that. I think AI has incredible potential to help us, rehumanize, and which is funny to think about, I guess, when we're fact checking, when we're doing these things. So kind of bringing back some of that. So I'm a big believer and proponent in seeing that more and more. But one thing you talked about in terms of suspicion, in terms of people questioning these assumptions, right? And I think about how different our world is. You mentioned Iraq War. Originally, when I was reading the piece you sent over, I was thinking back to World War One, World War Two, and just the information that was coming out and the unity that the U.S. had on certain fronts. Right, there was this unity during World War Two for for the most part. Um, there was a unity out of the Iraq War or out of 9/11 that produced in large part the Iraq War, and kind of going with these reactionary takes. And those are two very different examples, but less media outlets, less information outlets than what we see today. And this ties into talking about an anthropological theory of money, but that became such a metaphor for me for so many things. And one quote I wanted to read out that you sent over, where that confidence collapses, and you were referring to money, referring to state generated money. Um, but for me, that can go beyond that as well, just confidence
Mhm.
in the state, right? Um, when that confidence collapses, so does the power of law. And as a result, so does the value of any money whose acceptance is highly contingent upon that power. And then my thoughts were, world affairs, world order, high trust money and high trust institutions. Are we in a post trust age where, for me, the reason I'm such a proponent of Bitcoin, regardless of, yes, I'm a progressive, yes, all of these things, um, I think we're in an age, regardless of your political views, religion, ideology, where trusting in the government, trusting in these fiat currencies, with the amount of information we have out there, post Occupy, post Edward Snowden, post all of these things, is it even possible? I would say we shouldn't even seek to go back to a high trust or continue this high trust model. I would say don't trust,
Mhm.
verify. We're in a place where we don't need to trust. But is there even a way where we can go back to that? Because I think there's a real conflict in the world right now. A lot of governments are trying to impose super trust in an age where society is like, we don't trust even the
Right.
bare minimum of the way it
Yeah.
used to be. So for me, just reading what you sent over, I'm like, we seem to be in this post trust era of these government institutions. And it's a hopeful time in my mind, but it's also a
Mhm.
scary time in terms of what that might
Mhm.
look like.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're being reminded in real time of the premises of the Enlightenment era theories of limited government. Why were these early modern theorists of government so skeptical of state power? Well, because
Mm,
power should never be given the benefit of the doubt. It shouldn't be trusted as such. So the only way to ensure good government is to limit government. Today, we have government
mm,
involved in, I mean, would have been unimaginable the scale at which the US federal government, let's say, intervenes in not just the
mhm,
governance of states, but like the daily lives of individuals across the country. Like
mhm,
they're doing way, way, way too much. And
mhm,
their first response when there's a problem is that, oh, we should go do some more stuff. Um, what if
mhm,
what if the problem is that you're doing too much? What if the problem is
Hmm.
that, in fact, you're intervening in problems that you don't have the tools to solve? You don't have the capacity.
Hmm.
You're not set up as an institution to address these issues. Um, there's a kind of, it's not even humility, because that is a virtue. It's just a factual recognition of what can and cannot be achieved using different institutional forms. Um, so
Hmm.
unfortunately, we're living in a world where many people have difficulty imagining the consequences of misplaced trust in advance. They, you know,
Hmm.
they sort of have to be traumatized by over trusting, um, feeling betrayed, used, taken advantage of, harmed in some way, before they'll reconsider
Hmm.
their trust. The the Enlightenment era revolutions were about the opposite. We start with mistrust, and that mistrust
Hmm.
never goes away. We delegate very specific powers to the state that are extremely limited in scope, and then we take them back because the source of legitimacy is the consent of the governed, the people. Well, we've we've given the state so much power that at this point the presupposition has shifted that it is the state
Hmm.
that governs and gives rights, freedoms, whatever, to the people. I mean, it's fully backwards now. And so there's going to be a reset, and it's going to be terrible, and people will suffer.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. I'm always trying to figure out with my friends, with my brothers and sisters from the left, in terms of understanding that we should not trust institutions through movements like Occupy Wall Street, through movements like Black Lives Matter, through so many different movements. And I'm talking about kind of mainstream progressive left movements in the United States, but not applying that same thing to what we talk
Mm,
about in Bitcoin, what we talk about in the things you just mentioned, that someone would hear this clip or hear a clip of you saying small government and think that is a Republican or right leaning concept, right? And you are someone that is articulating, we're talking about like Enlightenment era thoughts, kind of the foundation of our country, the foundation of like what makes for a good society when there isn't a clear-cut answer, especially in a place like the United States. But where we're barreling towards is a bit dystopian. And again, I tend to approach these conversations very, realistic a lot. Like I'm not talking about, okay, the Fed and the dollar is going to collapse tomorrow, the government's going to be done tomorrow, the world's going to end tomorrow. I think a lot of things the government will find very crafty ways to keep a lot of things as is for as long as possible, maybe my entire lifetime. I'm not sure when we talk about a lot of these things, but from your view, just thinking about humans, thinking about behavioral science, thinking about social science, some of the things you were mentioning earlier, where is this disconnect coming from with, I mean, bear with me, from
mhm.
the left on some of the things that you talk about. It's almost like and then we can jump into some of David Graeber's lovely thoughts on Bitcoin, which is disappointing because I would agree with him on a lot of other things. Yeah, that's something I'm always trying
Yeah,
to wrestle with. I think given this platform and speaking to progressives, just friends of my own life and in the Boston area, with Harvard just around the corner and Elizabeth Warren, all of it, right? I'm kind of immersed in these two
yeah,
worlds constantly and beating my head
yeah.
against the wall about it.
Well, this is part of the limitation of using a word like the left to refer to
Mm.
a a broad coalition of people. They're
Yeah,
yeah.
extremely broad.
Um, Historically, political currents on the left or labeled leftist have had both extremely statist and non-statist currents within them. So, there was
Mhm.
a kind of Marxist, although not not necessarily Marxian. Marx was very ambivalent
Yeah,
about
different
the
than the
state,
philosophy
but a
that yeah,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
his
Yep.
inheritors
Yep.
believed firmly
Yep.
that it was the mandate of the state to ensure
Mhm.
um, a dictatorship of the proletariat, to in effect seize the reins of power, of state power, and impose by force a world in which
Mhm.
labor dominates capital. Um, you know, so there's a long inheritance of that. There's a long tail of that, where I would say today the primary characteristic of um, various movements, which could be called leftist, is a focus on redistribution of wealth, and using
Mhm.
the state to enforce that redistribution. Um,
Mm.
there used to be a whole anarchist left that, like, we've sort of forgotten about culturally. Even Graeber.
Mhm.
Graeber may be one of the most
Mhm.
influential public intellectuals kind of coming out of that tradition, but even Graeber is
Mhm.
far more statist than his predecessors would be. Even though he calls
Mhm.
for an abolition of the state. Um, you know,
Mhm.
there's no mechanism by which to do that. There's no, like, uh, political economy account of how that could happen. There is just this kind of utopian vision that,
Mhm.
the contradictions of market economies, sort of Marxian, will
Mhm.
cause them to collapse and with them the state. Um, But in the
Right.
meantime, the state should absolutely be deployed to redistribute wealth, and guarantee certain
Mhm.
basic standards of living. Um, so I think this is one of the reasons it can be so hard to have a conversation about limited government. People like
Mhm.
Henry David Thoreau, I mean, from the 19th century,
Mm.
classical, like, American anarchist. Is he right or left? I
Mhm.
mean, you could read his stuff and, um, think like, "Oh, this reminds me of Ted Kaczynski." Or, it reminds
Mhm.
me of,
Yep.
like, hippies, like, at Occupy Wall Street. Like, it
Mhm.
culturally, it
Yep.
doesn't fit. And so that should be interesting to us. This is the whole point of exposure to difference, exposure to other cultures.
Mhm.
Difference is not a rainbow coalition of people who all, believe the same things, use the same social media, are competing for the same jobs in the same educational institutions in the same center of empire. That's maybe a certain
Mhm.
kind of diversity, but it's a flat diversity. Diversity is encountering people who you have no frame for. You don't
Mhm.
automatically have a box that you can put them in. Um, and having the
Right.
discipline to be in that discomfort. A lot of what
Mhm.
motivates tribalism is just people don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to do the work of really understanding someone who is different from them, and so they'll put them in a box and move on. Um, that's
Yeah.
not acceptable in the kind of global society that we have brought about technologically.
Yeah, we're really ill-equipped. It maybe I'm not giving humanity enough credit. Do you think that we as humans, just evolutionary, we're trying to adapt to this? Do you think we inherently are that word's a loaded word, but do you think we're at all equipped to do some of that rationalization and that other factors are influencing it, political influence, in-group influencing? social media influence, or do you think that humanity, we're still trying to catch up as a species to figuring out having all of this access to mechanisms of tribalism in this new and amplified way?
Yeah.
um there's probably not an answer to that, but I'm just wondering, like, do we still have a ways to go on that, or is there ways we can do this sooner rather than later? Because the world's in a pretty precarious place to continue
Yeah, I
doing
mean,
this.
that's always the question, right? Is, um, how quickly can we develop the character, the habits
Hmm.
of thinking, the etiquettes, the relational skills to, skillfully navigate the possibilities that the amplification of power, which is all technology is, now affords us. Um, so,
Hmm.
the uh, Alfred North Whitehead has a quote from his book on symbolism, where he says that major technological breakthroughs inevitably destroy the societies that produce them. Um,
Hmm.
Now, what that means may vary from instance to instance, but it's absolutely true. The Industrial Revolution destroyed feudal Europe. Um, there's,
Hmm.
I mean, there's no going back to that. Um, the atomic age destroyed a certain form of Westphalian nationalism. We had to adapt to the power to destroy ourselves. That adaptation,
Yeah, I have to.
yeah,
I have to stop you there. What did you see Oppenheimer, and what did you think of it?
yeah,
Speaking
I
of
did
that.
see it. I thought it was well done. I appreciated in particular um, the way they painted that historical era, of the importance of the German emigres, scientists that the United
Yeah.
States absorbed during and after the Second World War. I mean, we were not a scientific country before that era. We had little,
Yeah.
emergent bubbles of innovation and breakthroughs, but it was really
Hmm.
the mass importation of, like, the top European talent across uh, the sciences, the humanities, philosophy, um, you know,
Hmm.
that seeded the American post-war education system and scientific laboratories. I mean, if you look at the history of Nobel Prize winners, many of them are American, but they're immigrants. And so
Hmm.
that
Yep.
was, I thought, the most interesting thing about that movie, and something that maybe many Americans aren't aware of.
Yeah. Sorry, I only cut you off because you were talking about the mood of the state of the
Mhm.
world with the advent of the atom bomb and kind of nuclear age. And that film, I think, for me, captured a bit theatrically. Yeah, it was Christopher Nolan and enjoyable to watch, but the mood shift and helped you feel, wow, what this
Yeah,
did for the world, and how it
absolutely.
changed.
Mhm.
Yeah. 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 I think w- one of the things that's interesting to me, and I kind of mentioned this previously before we were recording, but back to kind of this conflicts left and right. And one of the things that I focus on a lot with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin gets labeled as it is a commodity money, but Bitcoin in itself is this technological revolution that I hear more and more people saying it this way, but I think everyone should continue. It is its own and new thing, right? It is commodity money, but it is also in effect easy payments, fast payments, final settlement. All of these things really important. It does not fit your box, right? We have some historical reference to how we can paint it, right? But I love when people are like, okay, it's labeled as a commodity, great. I'm like, well, I still don't like that there it's money though. It's being labeled and boxed as a commodity for regulation purposes. There's all of these different things I feel about it. But one thing that frustrates me coming from the left is, it the way it's talked about in economic circles, in society for those that care, is commodity money is for
Mhm.
the right or for the US libertarians, and that's that. So Bitcoin is a commodity money Therefore, Bitcoin is for US libertarians. Bitcoin is for those exclusively in the Austrian camp. And just labeling like left is credit theory and that's it. Okay. If you're a progressive, that's what you have to believe in. That's what you have to stick with. And right is commodity. Again, just more infighting. So, why do you think these just, again, making everything political, making something like money is
Mhm.
political? Why do you think that came about and is still with us to this day when talking about like
Yeah, I
Bitcoin,
mean,
for
this
instance?
this it goes back to the broad diffuse consensus on the left that the role of the state is to fund social programs and redistribute wealth.
Mm,
So what that means is, you have to have a certain level of taxation, but you also, if you can, need to break past whatever limitations you may have um, around the money supply. So, i-
mhm,
if money can grow infinitely, then why can't we just, create a world where where life for ordinary people is fully subsidized? And there is no more poverty,
mhm,
there's no more suffering, unnecessary suffering. Um, there really is this belief that um, we have to have unlimited credit money in order to ameliorate the condition of the poor and the middle class.
mhm,
And so it's not even a theory of money as such. The theory of money is downstream. It could be
mhm,
anything. Um, Whatever's going to get us to the most direct path for ameliorating poverty and providing social services. Um, the challenge, of course, is that you know the world doesn't conform to what you want it to be. There are actual material
mhm,
constraints around value that do kick in, and it's not a right wing observation to make that the periods of robust inflation historically have always correlated with expansion of the money supply. Um, it's just
mhm,
it's just an empirical fact. There is a physics of value, and so what is it, in fact, that ameliorates the condition of the poor historically? Well, economic
mhm,
growth is the single most powerful indicator of raising standards of living for everyone. That does not mean it's the growth is equitably distributed. That doesn't mean everyone's happy about it. That
mhm,
doesn't mean that any particular individual isn't going to lose out in some way. But the engine of growth is the only robust mechanism for poverty alleviation. And this is ultimately what
mhm,
the Chinese Communist Party came to understand in the late Mao and post Mao era. They were like, you know,
mhm,
we have to grow. There is no way to lift 1 billion people out of poverty by just printing money and redistributing the
mhm,
wealth that already exists in our society. We have to become a market oriented society, but we're going to do it on Chinese socialist principles. So, that was the entire Deng Xiaoping era. And, to a certain extent, although he's considered more conservative now, Xi Jinping is still it's capitalism with uh, Chinese characteristics, with socialist characteristics. So there's no way around that. Which means we have to, if we're genuinely concerned about poverty alleviation, um, think through the conditions for creating a robust engine of economic production. What are those conditions? And in fact, those can be defined.
yeah, and I think one thing both camps do. And again, I get so frustrated saying it out loud to you even now, and I'm sure you are too, but I keep talking in this, okay, the left and the right, because that is the world we still live in. That is the polarity that I'm trying to have a bit of an influence of, just from the Bitcoin and left space. And hopefully we can then just talk about ideas in a less polarized world. Um, but in terms of both camps, I think they feel like they have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, there's ways to infuse progressive or left's way of approaching solving problems without, okay, running insane deficits, right? Like, currently, if you go on the Progressive Caucus's website, which I did recently when talking to Bradley Retler, just to, we talked about, I broke down some of the, like, I agree with a lot of the tenets of what they're pursuing in terms of values that I would align with. But they made an emphasis saying, focusing on the budget deficit. It didn't say this verbatim, but it was kind of argued that that is a
Hmm.
racist notion. That if you focus on the deficit and if you're overly concerned with deficit spending, I think they might be saying, Republicans say, oh, under a Democratic president, we need to rein in the deficit. But when there's a Republican president, Republicans don't talk about the deficit, right? Both parties do this in different ways. But that would probably be the one place that I veer away from the left so extremely on currently, is what you just said. Like, the evidence is the ship has sailed in terms of deficit and money printing. That does have an impact on inflation. What is everyone agreeing inflation has the biggest impact on? Low and working class people. It
Yeah.
doesn't alleviate poverty. So for me, I'm like, progressive, let's get in the corner. Let's, like, hey, we have to get away from this deficit narrative, this credit expansion narrative. Now, is there ways to rein this in? I'm even saying, can we just take baby steps, right? And those baby steps might include, and this maybe is my more controversial take, maybe we do need to tax corporations more. Maybe we do need to reduce defense spending if we want to fund this. We need to figure out what can and can't we pay for, right? That doesn't lead to the deficit we're in. And maybe the two sides disagree on that, right? No, we need to cut this program and that. But at least then you're not disagreeing on the fundamental principle of what you just described. And we're
Hmm.
not there yet, with agreeing to that. Do you? Yeah, I guess I just still I think, I don't want to speak for them. I think the Biden administration, you'd be hard pressed to see them say, okay, the COVID stimulus packages did not have a large correlation to inflation that happened afterwards. I'm pretty sure they would still articulate supply chain issues, COVID issues, these type of things for why we're seeing this amount of inflation. I'm not sure if anyone, maybe I'm wrong. Someone can correct me, or you can correct me. I haven't seen their camp come out and say, yeah, that led to more inflation. I mean, they were pretty adamant at the time, like, this is not going to
Hmm.
increase inflation. It's going to increase economic growth and do all the
Hmm.
things that you just said. So I guess I still find it hard to believe that they're still doing these same talking points of, no, it isn't
Hmm.
increasing inflation, because people's lives are not
Hmm. Yeah.
improving. And I'm running out of ways to say, like,
Right.
this is an issue for
Yeah.
the left.
I mean, no, Jerome Powell famously, in 2019, made a statement that, economists need to fundamentally rethink the, settled presupposition that money supply is tied to inflation. We've now conclusively gotten to the point where we've proven that that is not the case, and that in fact we can
Mm,
dramatically expand money supply without impacting inflation. Well, they did it, and they found out, and so in fact they were publicly wrong. And the
mm,
problem with, for the most part, the political class is that they function in bad faith. So they
mhm,
don't admit mistakes. They have talking points to get done what it
right.
is they've already decided that they're going to do. This is not a democracy. There is no democratic consensus. There's no meaningful opportunity for pushback. They have a plan that they're executing against. And like in any
Mhm,
authoritarian regime, they can be persuaded to change that plan if fear of social unrest um, becomes strong enough. If they start worrying that in fact they're going to start having riots in like big cities, or, stochastic violent events, like the January 6th uprising. Like, those are the things that make them
Mhm.
concerned, and they will then backtrack. They're not gonna admit they were wrong. They're just going to try to figure out how to untangle the web they've woven. Well, now they've woven a web. So that's the new set of presuppositions that everyone goes into the future with. Like, things immediately become Lindy
Mhm.
politically. Like Trump's wall project, which seemed to a lot of people just kind of crazy when he was first talking about it. I mean, the Biden administration has just accelerated it. They're
Mhm.
they're just continuing in the same way, like uh, you know, uh, the Obama administration just inherited the war on terror and um, upped the number of, drone strikes and assassinations worldwide. Like, they didn't roll back any of the W. Bush era um, legislation or just day to day practice of the intelligence
Mhm.
organizations, agencies, of our global military apparatus. They just intensified it. And so this is the problem. That
Mhm.
it's the same problem with money printing. Once it starts, it doesn't stop. Because the there's a kind of glomming on to whatever is already underway in the people that form the apparatus of the state, that they function from the consensus of their peers. And so it takes a real, like, uh radical or potentially extremist leader to come along and break that. Um, and so
Mhm.
we're beginning to hear talk of dictatorship. The 2025 project, articulated by the Heritage Foundation and
Mhm.
Trump explicitly. Uh, they're calling for dictatorship because they don't see a way to break through this powerful wave of consensus where everything just kind of
Mhm.
continues iterating in a worse direction. That said, dictatorship isn't a solution. Dictatorship just just creates a different set of problems.
I guess one of my thoughts is, are you someone that, I'll say it very broadly, believes in the political process at this point, in terms of, do you think there's actions that we could take to make things a little bit better, or do you think, we're swimming upstream and there's no chance of getting through it, in our current state of affairs? Do you think there's tweaks or mechanisms? That's one thing I've talked with a lot of guests on, and what I like about this episode is, I don't think you've said Bitcoin once. I've said Bitcoin a couple of times, and I've talked with many people about, one of the big things with Bitcoin is we got to talk about the problems in the world as they are, right? That Bitcoin kind of helps you go down that rabbit hole. Um, but do you see that there's things we can do now to address some of this political nightmare? Because Bitcoin does not solve that. Bitcoin, there's still problems with power, with political power. There's all of these things that, um, we're hard pressed to find answers for in
Yeah,
this day and age.
absolutely. So yes, there are always things you can do. Um, we make our own history, but not under conditions of our own choosing, as
Mhm.
Marx famously said. Um,
Mhm.
so we always start with ourselves. Each one of us has power. Each one of us has responsibility. Um, each one of us has impact. And so we need to begin by asking ourselves, how do I live my life in such a way that um, I bring about the world that I want to live in, at least in my own sphere? So we start with ourselves,
Mhm.
um, and then our local communities. That's actually where the average person has the most impact, and that's where people are least likely to
Mhm.
be engaged. Um, what we're going
Yep.
to begin seeing in the United States, I suspect, is the the cities asserting themselves um, with
Hmm.
courageous leadership that can potentially push back against some of the trends emanating either from state capitals or from federal capitals. So local
Hmm.
involvement, yes. Um, I think at the federal level, there's very little that the average American can do. Um, that
Hmm.
even at the state level, it's very hard because our political system has been fully colonized by the political parties, and these are
Hmm.
they're authoritarian organizations. So they're not democracies. The parties are not democratic. They are ruled with an
Hmm.
iron fist by the people at the top of the party who are usually the party's biggest fundraisers. And so, goes back to money, where, the donors
Hmm.
and the politicians that have the closest relationship with the donors, in effect, set the policy agenda for the party and actively preclude anyone from running for office that would go against that agenda. And so,
Hmm.
we're seeing some interesting cracks in that happen with some more independent minded candidates come out, like RFK
Hmm.
Jr., for example, or, oh gosh, I mean, before he became the Republican Party candidate, Trump, Bernie Sanders was an independent who
Hmm.
ran as a Democrat, didn't win. So we're seeing some of these like influences come from the side at the federal level, but for the most part, they're people who either have a lot of money or a lot of celebrity or both, or have
Hmm.
lifelong, political careers already in higher office. So I think for most ordinary Americans, the question is going to be what can be done at the level of my community.
Yeah, and back to what you were saying too about people influencing things. I'm a big believer in kind of the charismatic leader phenomenon throughout human history. It's these interesting things of as a Bitcoiner, I've fully consumed don't trust, verify in a lot of areas, a lot of places. But what's interesting, like Bitcoin, for example, Satoshi had to create the white paper, right? There's these people that have to step up and do things. Declaration of Independence, Jesus of Nazareth, Gandhi, these charismatic leaders that I'm a big proponent of that propelling human history in those different moments. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that, who steps up in different places around the world to do these different things. Someone stepping up, doing the right thing, and then stepping away, right? Creating that movement, creating that technology, whatever it is, and stepping away. That's something that for me, it's not necessarily a science, but one thing I'm like, that throughout human history has seemed to be
Yeah.
intact. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, like so many great examples of without that moment or action, that happened to be the person that stepped up. So looking for people to do the same in this day and age. And do you think that that is something that's harder and harder? Do you think it's easier with the information dissemination technology use we have going on today? How do you view those type of movements going
Well, I
forward?
mean, there's no shortage of charismatic leaders. The question is just what are they leading us toward? I mean, I would suggest that,
Right.
you know, America overflows with charisma. We live in a
Hmm.
celebrity mediated culture where like, everyone's trying to be famous, everybody's trying to be rich, and everybody, thinks they know what's best for the country and, they just need personal power to make that happen. Um, and so
Hmm.
it's very rare that you encounter a someone who is a charismatic leader, but also selfless enough to give up power that they may have accrued or created the conditions for. That is very rare.
Hmm. Yeah, and do you? It's been a talking point in politics for a long time, but do you ever feel, this next election? I mean, the left has been very notorious of it. Hillary Clinton, especially in her campaign that ended in failure, obviously to Trump in 2016, constantly talking about we're in the fight for our democracy. This is it. This is the election year after year, and I think I would hope most people have caught on at this point. Most of the general population is like, you said that the last
Hmm.
time, and the time before that, and the time before that, and the time before that. Um, is there any fear? Not on a if so and so wins or this person wins, but just in general, the more we get towards some of those things that you're saying, people are articulating. We need a dictator. We
Yeah.
need a benevolent king. Those things. This next political cycle, regardless of which party wins, right? Because I think both have totalitarian tendencies in different regards, maybe are similar in a lot of ways. Do you worry about those things heading into political elections or systems, or do you think it's just a bit of a bit of marketing from different
Yeah.
political
No, I mean,
camps?
the the structure of the state is at this point totalitarian. There's no doubt about it. They have
Mm,
full visibility into um, everything you do digitally. Um, they may not want you to know all of that, but then once it becomes public, you know, do they roll it back? No, Congress just passes legislation authorizing what the state was already doing. Um, there's just today an announcement that um, starting in 2027, a group of allied countries are going to be uh, sharing all crypto transaction data um, with one
mm,
another. So tax authorities, banks, police. I mean, they're going to know um, everything you do. I mean, there is no more freedom to transact. There is no more
mm,
freedom of speech. Um, and so, if there's no freedom to transact and there is no freedom to speak, um, none of your other rights are even possible to envision. Um,
it's a
so
foundation.
yeah,
Yeah.
to your point, the foundations are gone. So the best we
Hmm.
can hope for is a authoritarian state that chooses not to use some of the absolute power it has. Um, and that
Hmm.
hope is not a strategy.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, it's back to
Right.
the high trust that we talked about at the beginning of
Yeah.
the conversation. Um, my gosh, Natalie, people are going to leave this episode and they're like,
Yeah.
"What do I do?" Which is no one's intention, but I think articulating these things. An episode that will already be out by the time this one comes out too was with Jason Brett and Dennis Porter talking about FinCEN and
Mhm.
talking about some of these things. We've been focusing on this as well, in particular, because unfortunately it's happening on, again, both sides of the political aisle, but a lot of Democrats just going forward with this stuff. And us from the progressive Bitcoiner, it's like, I want to keep
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
no, it's wrong. It's not right. It's violating your rights. It's violating everything in the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment, First Amendment, so many different things. We need to speak up about this. Um, one thing I want to ask you too, kind of tying it back to your paper, is I know you deeply care about these things. You deeply care about what's a world with CBDCs could look like. That's a minor detail compared to everything you just said, right? I know you deeply care about these things and are concerned about these things because from what I can tell, it comes from a place of love and appreciation for the things that we have kind of created in establishing this country and establishing what I know you're pretty proud. You've mentioned before of your Polish heritage and immigration and a lot of the great things that immigrants have done in this country and the freedoms that we've expressed and everything you're devoting a lot of your work to. In terms of the Satoshi papers, in terms of your paper toward an anthropological, the word's always hard for me to say, theory of money, um, is there hope in those kind of theories? And I know that it seems like the point of the paper is really to try to articulate it in more of a
Hmm.
scientific way rather than a philosophical camp that we can fight on way, which is the way money has typically been done. Um, do you see or view that articulating these things might bring about a world where people are more intrigued about this idea of doing things that are in a less trust society way and more freedom for the individual type way. Do you see a direct correlation there? And is there hope for you
Yes.
on that front?
So in terms of what I'm personally doing, each of us is singular. We have singular talents, passions, interests, uh, proclivities, skills. Um, my main goal is to at least lay the foundations of a science of the political. Um, we do not have a
Mm,
political science, which means that our practice of politics is basically just vibes. Um, and
yeah.
vibes eventually devolve into fascism. Like
Hmm.
fascism is just feelings, a politics of who's with me, who's against me, sides, teams, and the desire to be a terrible winner. Um, and so,
Mm,
if we are to overcome that, to have a more rational, humane future for this species, then we have to begin seeing society and politics scientifically, which is the opposite of
mm,
what many romantics on both the right and the left want to do. In fact, I would suggest this has been
yeah.
the most important failure of the humanities and the social sciences in the West over the past century, is that their takeaway from the Second World War was we need to mystify humanity even more, and retreat into a kind of
Mm,
politics of um, aesthetics and feelings and state-led redistribution of wealth, like a kind of religious
mhm,
commitment
yeah.
to Marxism, that is ultimately just like vibes. Um, so there
Yeah.
has to be rigor. And
I'm only laughing because I'm thinking of like majors in colleges being called political
yeah,
vibes
yeah,
instead of political science. I majored in
exactly,
political vibes, and it's
exactly.
like that's so real because I was a poli sci sociology major, and I'm like, yeah, that's like I
Yeah,
was in political vibe
no,
classes
and
for
this is the
sure.
thing, many of the critiques coming from the right about the leftist academy, they're not wrong. There is definitely a kind of
Yeah.
indoctrination that happens. There is a team-based view of the world. You're, on
Mhm,
our side or you're a bad guy. There was a lot that, a lot of hostility that I personally encountered for having political views that might have differed from other people in the academy.
mhm,
And, then just indoctrination that I underwent that I've had to literally
mhm,
like painfully think my way out of post college, post
mhm,
grad school as an adult. So I think our systems of higher education are not equipped to develop a science of the political, which is one of the reasons
mhm.
that I function as an independent scholar. But that's not an excuse to be less rigorous. That is a prompt to be more rigorous.
And what's nice too, and I hope people can glean this, even if there's it's so funny. I've had different with this show in particular, we try to have so many different conversations, so many different people. I don't ever care or really ask. Sometimes I know people's personal politics or religion, all of that, whatever. Sometimes I have people say, "Oh, that person was too of the left. That person was too of the right." Some feedback I get of the show, and I'm like, listen, a lot of the general theme I hope people would pick up on is the people that I'm having on this show are ones that are able to have open and honest conversation and can start from a place of we should try to critically think and
Mhm.
be independent in thought. Usually I can have a
Yeah.
conversation with someone like that regardless of what our disagreements on. Like if they're a terrible person, sure, I'm probably not going to have them on the show, which I don't think
Well,
you're a
thank
terrible
you.
person, Natalie. I think you're a great person. That's another thing because some people are like I think this is just exactly what we're talking about. Some people will listen to a podcast because they want to agree
Hmm.
with everything being said, or they want to listen to a podcast because it makes
Mm-hmm.
them angry, because, so some people do that as well. So people listening might have disagreed with some of the things you said, might have disagreed with some of the things I said. Good. I hope you're not listening to this show and just agreeing with everything. And one last point that I wanted to bring up too, and ask you about, because I also saw some tweets, posts, whatever they're called now, out as well, and I think it's really pertinent to our political process, and the politics we were talking about, and the vibes, is just people's response to Israel-Palestine. I think you had posted a lot, and several others, about a very
Mm-hmm.
common statement, which is just,
Mm-hmm.
this is horrific. People being killed in Gaza. This is really bad. Hamas terrorist attacks were really bad. This response, and women and children dying, is really, really bad. How do you see the world as it is now, our country engaging in these political vibes when it comes to something as complicated and as serious as this matter for the people that live there currently, and for global affairs, whatever may come of this? And this episode will be out a few weeks after we're talking now. Unfortunately, I think the situation might be similar or worse. And if there are updates to be made, I'll be sure to mention that in terms of any of this. And again, this isn't to go into a history of this or your thoughts on this and that and this camp and that camp, but just what you're saying, I couldn't help but think to bring that up, because I think if we were able to get into a place where it's a political science, it's these things of rationalization, our political discourse, our ways of handling these situations, may be better for the world. So I'm curious your thoughts coming from that camp that you just described, seeing
Yeah.
what's happening there. How do you articulate some of that? What is that like for
Well,
you?
this is an issue that uh, I have been or felt personally invested in for a long time. My undergraduate work was
Hmm.
actually in Middle Eastern studies. Lived in the region.
Yeah, and you mentioned you had been to that
Mm-hmm.
area quite a bit as well, a little while ago, and talking about the experiences there as well. I saw you post
No,
about
yeah,
that, which was
absolutely.
beautiful.
And this comes out of my family history. In Poland
Mm,
during the Second World War, my grandmother's family sheltered Jews, both family and partisans who were fighting in the
mm,
Jewish version of the Underground Army, because they unfortunately
mhm,
had to be segregated for their safety. Um, and you know, housed refugees. My family fought in the underground army against the Nazis. Their farm was a weapons cache for the underground army.
mm,
I mean, this was a race obsessed totalitarian regime that was dedicated to the project of a mono ethnic nation state, and then a broader
mhm,
project of world domination from that center. Um, you know, Poland underwent a horrific ethnic cleansing, genocide, um, which was then continued by the communist regime that took over. So there was another set of pogroms against Polish Jews that resulted in the further expulsion of the Jewish population of that country. My takeaway from that historical episode was not great. I'm so glad that Poland is now a homogenous nation state where we no longer
mm,
have to deal with, these Russians and Lithuanians and Germans and Jews and Eastern Orthodox. We can now be one of the most homogenous countries in the world, ethnically and religiously. That is not an achievement. It is not something to celebrate. It is not something to be proud of. And so I
mm,
approach this conflict from principles. Again, not from tribal affiliations with either of the sides of this conflict. Obviously, these are human
mhm,
beings um, on both sides. It's the logic of the mono ethnic nation state that is the problem. That is a fascist
Mhm.
logic, and it is one that I have opposed and will always oppose everywhere I see it.
And I mean, that history, that rich family history, I think it carries through to everything you talk about and do. Like it's in you, that charisma for good. It's baked into your DNA. I'm sure you have had to felt that from a young age, with all of this. Yeah, I mean, I hope that people can feel similarly about that situation, and that somehow we navigate to a place that
Mhm.
ends this atrocity, because it's really dark and scary right now. Is one of the big things that's affecting a lot of people, and will continue to. Um, and lastly, I just want to touch on too, if there's anything else from your paper, from the Satoshi papers, any other hopes you have in terms of your work, looking out to the next few months, to the next year with the Satoshi papers and all the things you're speaking on and doing. Um, some lasting hope for people, in terms of this, because my belief is this is a critical point in history. Which, yes, I know people always say
Mhm.
that there are always critical points in history, but a lot of what we're talking about, there is quite a bit of things that are
Mhm.
going to go one way or another. We're at quite this pivotal point
Mhm.
with so many things, whether it's with the US economy with deficit spending, which means the global economy, whether it's with these world conflicts, there's outcomes that will happen of these things, of society going forward. What is your hope that individuals, that we as a nation, would come to some consensus on and move forward? What is your hope for that?
There's hope if you embody it. So
Mm,
you are the site of hope. What hope can you be the site of? And this actually goes back
mm,
to what we were talking about earlier. The calling, the vocation that is singularly yours. You finding your purpose becomes the foundation of hope for others. Um, so regardless of what is happening in the wider world, what is it that you can build right where you are today that others can inherit from you, um, that leaves the world
mm,
better than you found it? Um, and that goes for everything from how you live your life, the way you treat others, your personal relationships, the care you exert for your family, for your profession. But it also has to do with your purpose in your work. What are the unique skills, um, insights, and uh, and just labor that you can bring to achieving certain outcomes in your field. And so, I talked about moving toward a science of the political, um,
mm,
striving to ground the social sciences in something that is, more fundamental than just vibes. That is
mhm.
many lifetimes of work. Um, but embarking on that is what gives me hope. And I think one of the most inimical uh, anti-hope forces, let's say, is the emphasis in our current age on instant gratification, on short-term wins. Um, it's not that those things
Mhm.
are bad per se, but if you lose the long-term view, you've stopped building your civilization. You've started taking it apart. So the prevalence of grift, of people swooping in to get theirs and swoop out before everything collapses. I mean, that is the vicious cycle of destruction of a civilization. Um, it is only when
Mm.
we begin building towards aims that we can't yet see or imagine and are content with the fact that we may never see the final fruits of our work. Um, it's only then that we actually begin building something at a scale bigger than ourselves, a civilizational project.
Wow, that's an ushering, calling for people who are listening to this episode. But my one hope on that too is it's happened before, right? There's been pivotal moments in history where there were a lot of things that felt hopeless. I talked about a lot of world wars. I can imagine people, leaders, individual families, your family, like people were like, well, we have to put one foot in front of the other. We have to do something and channel that hope and see it. And then the world that came after was better
Yes.
than what it could have been, which could have been the end of the world. So if we can get through that, I think we can get through anything. I would agree with that. So I think that's a great calling to people. I want to thank you so much for your time. You're very gracious with your time and really enjoyed this conversation. Do you want to point people to anywhere in terms of where to follow you, whether to follow any of the various projects you got going on and affiliations?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on X at Smolenski, also at txbitcoinfoundation.org. So sign up for our mailing list if you want to be notified when the Satoshi Papers comes out. We are a 501c3. All donations are fully tax deductible. This is a volunteer effort on my part. I don't make money from this. I lose money on it. So any donations or sats that you can send my way will help us cover the publication expenses of this book and help us get it to you even faster.
Great. And we'll make sure all of that's in the show notes too, so people can please donate, support this work. And thank you, Natalie. This was so much. It's a hard conversation. It's fun though. It's fun. These conversations are really important. And thank you so much. We'll have to do it again soon.
Likewise. Thank you for having me, Trey.